Wonderment, there must be more behind this. It's the year 1884. A small boy, only 4 or 5 years old, is ill and lies in bed. His father gives him a compass, and the boy soon forgets that he's sick. The fact that the magnetic needle moves as through an invisible force field, instead of the more familiar mechanical method of movement or contact, creates a feeling of wonderment that he will always remember, and which will motivate him during his whole life. In later life, he will often come back to this experience, which has set the direction for the rest of his life. There had to be something deeply hidden behind the external side of things. He grows up fascinated by the big scientists and philosophers of his time. He learns to play the violin and becomes a great admirer of Mozart, in whose music he believes to recognize something of the harmony of the universe. When he struggles with difficult problems, the answers often come to him when he plays his violin in the kitchen for hours. He starts to dislike the German schools, where he's drilled to memorize facts in a very autocratic environment. But in the Swiss place Arau, he enrolls in a training institute where students are stimulated to think for themselves and to draw their own conclusions. Independent observation, the use of intuition, conceptual thinking, and the use of capability of visual imagination are common steps in the training program. This is where he flourishes. At the age of 16, he tries to imagine what it would be like if you could run so fast that you could keep up with a light wave. The wavelength would then be totally independent of time. But such a thing is, of course, impossible. 10 years later, he shocks the scientific world with the publication of an article that not only, against all traditions, had no single reference to the established order, but also disrupted his order completely. The theory of relativity was born. His name, Albert Einstein. His motto, imagination is more important than knowledge.
In more than one aspect, he was a remarkable man, but most of all because of his attitude. There are only 2 ways to live your life. One is as though nothing is a miracle, the other is as though everything is a miracle. I prefer the latter. In a letter that he would send to a friend in later life, he wrote, "People like you and me never grow old. We never cease to stand like curious children before the great mystery into which we were born." That is what we call, ladies and gentlemen, wonderment. Something happens that we do not understand, but at the same time we feel there must be some hidden truth behind this phenomenon. You could describe it as the condition of floating between knowing and not knowing. It opens the door to insight. If you open this door and enter, you will never be the same, because you open yourself for new insights, for growth. Wonderment is not the same as surprise, because surprise only touches our head. Wonderment touches our heart. It appeals to our intuition. There must be more behind this. What is it that has something behind it? There is something behind the world of shapes and phenomena, as Einstein found out at a very young age. Are there forces working behind these appearances, of which we know or could know that they really exist? For sure. Think of electricity, X-rays or radioactivity. Forces we can't directly experience with our senses, but of which we have provided sufficient proof for their existence. But what or who actually wonders? Is it your body? So are you your body? Or do you have a body? And are you the consciousness behind this body, the driver, so to speak?
If we believe that we are our body, we instantly get puzzled, because our senses have a limited perception. So where is this wonderment coming from? Instead, if we believe that we are the force behind our body, it becomes much more plausible that we can have an intuition for a deeper truth behind that what we observe with our physical senses. So the wonderment comes from ourselves, as we can hear in the following lectures. It comes from the higher parts of our consciousness. Many have wondered about the extraordinary pictures published by Masaru Emoto of water and ice crystals, of which the molecules showed very different patterns influenced by, for instance, music and certain thoughts. A certain group of skeptic scientists stated that this phenomenon was complete nonsense, considering the fact that water has no senses. If we, however, allow our wonderment and are willing to consider that there is a force working behind the manifestation, we can find an explanation for the behavior of the molecules. During this symposium, we therefore want to submit the following hypothesis to you. There is a force working behind appearances. We call this force consciousness. Everything that lives is consciousness and has the possibility to manifest itself and acquire experiences by way of a vehicle, a body. If you think about this, you could wonder where this force comes from. Could it be that this force is just a spark of a much larger fire? Can we think of anything that gives a limit, a boundary to the potential scope to that consciousness? Could it be that all life in its most pure essence is boundless? That there is something like boundless life, boundless space, boundless time, without a beginning and without an end? What happens if we use our imagination in order to build an image of this? Then we will start to realize that the possibilities of the vehicle, the body, are in fact limited, but that the possibilities for growth of what we are in our essence, boundless.
We will start to understand that we can always keep wandering in principle. We'll therefore start also to realize that this boundlessness at itself is the largest source of wonderment. It's the third. The possibilities of our growth are boundlessness. We will ask you after the last lecture, tomorrow afternoon, you can once more look at these hypotheses and decide for yourself whether you wish to explore this hypothesis further. This also means that we want to invite you to not accept or reject anything just like that during the next 2 days, but to try as much as possible to allow wonderment in yourself and explore for yourself what is true and what isn't, and what is worth further exploring and what isn't. This is in fact the foundation of what we will elaborate on during this symposium as spiritual growth. We're going to the cycle of spiritual growth. You've seen this in our program. It's a cycle which we'll elaborate on in the next 2 days. And we started at the top, Wonderment. And if we do not desire wisdom, we are never in the state of wonderment and we can never come to a philosophy. And we need this philosophical foundation to build discipline. And, as the old axiom states, discipline precedes the mysteries. This cycle is the central theme for this symposium, where today we will mainly focus on the wonderment and the philosophy, and tomorrow we will focus more on discipline and the mysteries, as you will most likely have noticed in the program. Do you actually recognize this state of consciousness, this what we call wonderment? Kids wonder naturally. A child looks up at the starry sky and asks, how can it be that the stars do not fall out of the sky? Only a few adults still wonder. So many stars. Is it not very unlikely that we are the only life in this universe? They catch a glimpse of boundlessness, so to speak. The fact that we wonder about different things is actually not so strange if we assume that consciousness, which we are in essence, just like the body for instance, can be in different states of development.
Sugata Mitra, a researcher in education who was driven by the ideal to offer qualitatively good schooling to every child, executed a famous and, in his own word, absurd experiment. He placed a computer with software on biochemistry on a university level in a wall in the vicinity of a school on the countryside in the southern part of India. Subsequently, he told a few curious kids in Tamil, the local language, that the computer contained very interesting and important information, but that the information was in English and that he also didn't understand it himself. But let's see what happened.
The children repeat their discoveries, create a new vocabulary to describe their experiences. The group gets divided into knows and know-nots. Knowledge from others is taken in return for friendship. The children work as a team, teaching each other. The hole in the wall, a child's window into the future.
Zo zien we meteen hoe verwondering eruit kan zien.
Now we see what wonderment looks like.
Wat trof deze wetenschapper nou aan toen hij na een paar
What
maanden
did this scientist find out when he returned a few months later? 12-year-olds had not only taught themselves English, but they had even built an image of the educational material, which was actually developed for young adolescents 10 years older than they were. They understood the concept of DNA and the fact that neurons communicate with each other. We often find Einstein unique, not only because he kept wondering, but also because his enormous ability of imagination. The experiments with which he built his theories all took place in his head. Apparently, that is not unique for Einstein, but we all possess this enormous potential of imagination as children. So what do children wonder about? You can call something, you can say something. About what do you say? Insects. What do they wonder about with these insects? How is it possible that they fly, they crawl? How is it possible? That's a sort of a question of kids wonder about. It's a good example. Sorry, I cannot hear what the person is saying.
Ergens moet er toch een eind zijn. Ik roep het even in de microfoon zodat we het daar ook kunnen horen. Ja, eigenlijk moet het eindig zijn, maar dat blijkt dus niet het geval.
Life has to have an end, but it doesn't. That asks for wonderment.
Ja, zo langzamerhand krijg je dan het gevoel dat er achter.
You get the feeling that behind the stars that we see, something has to be behind there. That is. Maybe it's boundless. What is behind these stars? Thank you. When was the last time when you wondered? What was this about? About a small bird, I hear somebody say. I saw it in the garden. And how it was squeaking. Oh, there's a microphone. I was working in the garden, and I saw a small bird who was looking for food, and I thought that was really, really pretty. Yeah, we can just wonder about small things that happen in the garden. Anybody else?
Hoe kom je op dat idee, dat hole in the wall?
How do you come for this idea for this hole in the wall?
Waar komen ideeën van?
Where does it come from? Where do these ideas come from?
Ja, dat is een hele mooie vraag.
That's a really beautiful question.
2 microfoons, het maakt niks uit.
And
Straks ga ik gewoon roepen.
we still have some problems with the microphone.
Mooie vraag. En eigenlijk is het te mooi om
It's a good question, but it's nice enough not to answer it straight away, but maybe over the course of this symposium we can keep it in mind, and maybe we found we've retrieved some material to think about this.
Ja, wat gebeurt er nou eigenlijk met ons als we ons verwonderen?
What happens to us when we wonder?
We raken even onze eerste
For a short time, we lose our grip, we lose control. For a moment, we become aware of something bigger than that we always thought we knew. Our first reaction is usually one of confusion. We experience a short circuit in our head. Our personality, in its need for stability, tries to recover its grip on the reality as we thought we knew. The door to a larger truth was actually opened for a short while, but we usually close it quickly. Why? Because our personality experiences this floating situation between knowing and not knowing as uncomfortable.
This way we'll know that when we hear ourselves saying yes, but, we're working on defending our familiar statements. At that moment we're not open for something else than the things we think we already know. The Dutch artist and innovator Daan Rozengaarde designed a chair for every area in which it is important to consider to be open for new ideas, which will give a shock to the person who sits on it at the moment this person says, yes, but. To help you in your search for practical spirituality, we have placed 300 of those chairs in this room. So our first challenge is to have the courage to start investigating, with the idea that we will learn something, but not knowing what that will be. The next challenge arises when we think to have found the answer to our question. Where do ideas come from, for example? If it feels right, or it seems to be right in 80% of the observations, we quickly assume that it will be right. The newly found truth crystallizes and takes the place of the old truth. Besides many great scientists who have provided us new insights with their explorative approach, there are unfortunately also scientists who are hiding in their ivory tower. A theory which explains why swans are white is great. But when we find out that 1 in every 1,000 swans is black, and the theory cannot explain this, people are usually tempted to stubbornly keep the old theory instead of searching for a new, more comprehensive one. We still know Louis Pasteur because he published about diseases being external organisms which attack us from outside our body, and that we had to protect our body against them. His contemporary and counterpart, Béchamp, is much less known. Where Pasteur assumed separate entities, Béchamp intuitively assumed boundlessness. Where there are no boundaries, there should be mutual connections logically. Béchamp's research showed that the external organisms, which Pasteur was talking about, were exactly the building blocks of life. And that disease is more an internal disharmony rather than an external attack. As was said, Pasteur finally acknowledged this on his deathbed and agreed with Béchamp's theory. However, his theory was already so widespread that even today it still plays an important role in the way Western medical science looks at the concept of disease. How can we stimulate ourselves to get into this phase of wonderment as much as possible, through which we can become aware of a continuously growing truth and as a result grow? Let's try to illustrate that with an example. Ian Stevenson is a young doctor and he continually sees patients with apparent similar backgrounds developing different disease patterns.
He comes to the conclusion that the two most prevailing attitudes, first, heredity, and second, the Freudian idea that the development of the personality is being formed in the first years of the life, cannot fully explain why the persons whom he meets develop certain phobias and diseases. He therefore decides to investigate himself whether or not there is a third possibility. In the course of his research, he starts to suspect that in some way there is a possible transition of memory or personality. When he hears stories about very young children who say that they're able to remember their previous lives, he does something remarkable. Instead of saying, "This is impossible, according to what I know, and I have studied this, so it's nonsense," he gets in a plane and decides to investigate this. The next 40 years, he flies around the world and studies more than 3,000 cases in which reincarnation is being suggested in a scientific way. There are many cases in which there are multiple possible explanations for the stories and strange birthmarks which he comes across, but he also discovers black swans. What is so special about Stevenson is not only the enormous effort which he has put into doing such groundbreaking research, and with which he, in the most positive way, was only ignored by his colleagues, but also that he was always able to keep this framework open for new possibilities. He therefore never assumed that he had found a definitive answer, but that reincarnation was just the best possible explanation up until that moment. He kept his conclusions fluid, so to speak. A few years before he died, he was already in his 80s, he was asked if his work was not one big failure because he hadn't been able to convince the world of reincarnation. He said that it was his hope that his research would bring the established science to the point where they would at one point further study the possibility of reincarnation. His ideal and his imagination reached beyond the duration of his own life. Pim van Lommel, the Dutch cardiologist, followed his footsteps with his own study of the possibility of the existence of consciousness as a driving force behind the body, as an explanation for situations, which wondered him, and published these in his book Consciousness Beyond Life. He also expressed his wish that his hypothesis would not be accepted but seriously studied. So it's possible to stimulate this state of wonderment in order for it to occur frequently. It requires an attitude from us in which we let go of our prejudices and step into something with the starting point that we don't know anything. Zen Buddhism calls this strikingly beginner's mind.
Are you also capable to let go of your prejudice and adopt a keen and open mind? In nature, we come across plenty of reasons for wonderment, such as in the following movie. You will be shown a few examples of order according to mathematical patterns. First the so-called Fibonacci series, and subsequently the golden ratio and the number 5.
Ja, als je dat nu ziet,
When you see this, do you also wonder how is that possible? And are you also willing to study this question? Because if wonderment is the starting point from where we can come to a higher truth, it would also be the logical starting point for spiritual growth. Prince Siddhartha grew up in a very protected environment. When he finally left the palace and was confronted with sickness and death for the first time, he wondered. He asked himself if the power of Brahma failed here, and if so, if Brahma was then an actual god. Shortly after that, he left the palace forever in order to find out if there was a way to stop suffering. Ladies and gentlemen, summarizing. Wonderment, the condition of floating between knowing and not knowing, opens the door to insight. Wonderment can be stimulated by letting go of our prejudice and assuming a beginner's mind. Wonderment is the starting point for spiritual growth. And there are principle no limits to the growth potential of consciousness. We thus always have a reason to wonder. As we have seen in the various examples, every individual study to a higher truth starts with wonderment.
What are you wondering about? What would you like to study yourself during this symposium? Do you want to think about this for a short moment? Further on in this symposium, we will look for answers on your questions together. This afternoon, during the spiritual practical and during the workshop tomorrow, you will get the opportunity to do some research yourself. Tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock, this symposium will be over. But never stop wondering, questioning and relying on the faculty of imagination. Where do ideas come from? If we take boundlessness as a starting point, there is always a higher truth to reveal. So don't pretend to know it all and postpone this idea towards infinity. In the words of Gottfried de Perucker, you need to realize always that what you think you understood is only the entrance to a room of knowledge, from where you can look outside through clean windows at even greater panoramas of wonder, and that room of knowledge has doors, an entrance and an exit, through which you can enter even more wonderful dwellings. In the next lecture, Barend and Erwin will discuss with you the following. What is it in yourself that wonders? How can we find answers to your questions? And how do we know if these answers are true? But first, your...
Yes, this lady has a question. There will be a mic brought to you. I think it's not only through wonderment, it goes through wonderment, this development. Thinking as such is also a possibility. That's the question. Can you elaborate on this? Thinking is also a possibility. Well, what is wonderment then, in your idea? Well, I've got certain things in life are not for nothing. They don't happen to you. They come from something. And I've noticed that it's not only in now, in this life, that it must only be in this life, those changes, but there was something more to this. the questions that I've asked, I couldn't find the answers. I couldn't find in this life, in my. And did you already find the answers? Yes, I found the answers. And are they already printed in stone, or are you still searching? Reincarnation, yes. And maybe one day you're going to wonder, am I going to really go through this? I didn't realize this in Wonderment, but I just thought in this life I can't find it in this life, so there has to be something more. And that of course you have to think about before you come to an answer to this question. We start today with Wonderment, and the philosophy is the next step. But it's not through Wonderment. I think she makes a distinction between wonderment and thinking. Where does this question come from? Certain things that happen in this life. If you can't place those things, if you can't find certain answers in this life, then you think there has to be more. Yeah, you're completely right, and I totally agree with you. So it's not through Wonderment. I think we're talking about exactly the same thing. Wonderment is the state in which you look for the answers. So we just gave it a different name. So it's not Wonderment, she thinks. Well, I think if you have another name for it, I don't have a problem with that. Ian Stevenson, yes. I'm going to give you an example. Ian Stevenson also did something else. He did a lot of research for 40 years, and he couldn't find another conclusion that there was reincarnation, but he wasn't sure. But how did we know he wasn't sure? He told his colleagues that there is a safe at school with a code, and if he died, he would give the codes after his life. But of course, it didn't work. So his research went on. A different question.
With me, it happened in this way. I have experienced things, and I wonder, and I have forgave. My passion is Jesus, and I give something, and with other people it's a different thing, but it's something above natural, and then you forgive. So you're saying, did you find something that is behind it? She says, no. It just happened, and sometimes you become mad and you feel revenge, but that makes you sick. And then you start forgiving, and then you come in harmony. And now I wonder about nature and about the creation. We just want you to think if you could wonder about this, and we all give it a different name, and one person names it Jesus, and one person names it Buddha, but we wonder, is there something more behind this? Thank you for your example.
Next question. Evert, this lady in blue has a question. This is the last question. Do you know what I wonder about? Why is there so much war? Why, as humans, can we not live in peace? That's what I wonder about. That's a very good remark, and we can't answer this. And I asked this myself. I looked very hard for the answer, and when I almost had the answer, the next question came: what are you doing about it? Meditate, I hear as an answer. Maybe there are some other answers, and maybe the Theosophy will give you some answers. What I regret is that all these wars are on religion, and everyone believes in something. And so, do you think they are in a state of wonderment when they're fighting? Maybe. When you are in a state of wonderment and you stay in that state, then you're always open for truth. So when war is out, wonderment is gone. We think we have found the answer and then we fight about this. So that is where it goes wrong, really. Okay, thank you.